All right, today we're going to start with the chapter 3, the early African societies and Bantu migrations. That's the official name of the chapter, but of course, most people refer to it as ancient Egypt or the Nile River Valley. We'll talk very briefly about the Bantu migrations at the end of this chapter. But this chapter really focuses on, like I said, the Nile River Valley. And the Nile River Valley is in modern day Egypt and northern Sudan, and it's a little unique, the Nile River, in that it flows from the south to the north. We of course think here in the United States, like Mississippi River flows southward. People always assume that all rivers flow south. That is not actually the case. What makes the Nile so unique, in addition to obviously the direction it flows, is the fact that it floods pretty predictably. When we talk about early river valleys, and the Nile really is the mecca of all early river valleys because of the rich silt that it deposits every time it floods, and like I said, it's predictable. So you could pretty much depend on having a pretty steady food supply for the majority of the history of early Egypt, at least. Herodotus, the Greek historian, referred to the crops that are produced in the Nile River Valley as the gifts of the Nile because they were so plentiful. Which of course opens the way for a joke. What happens when Mr. Dunham asks out a pretty girl? I'll give you a second. No answer? Well, the answer is denial. That's right, denial. Absolute denial. It's probably funnier if I'm delivering this joke in person, but I figured I'd give it a shot. The Nile River Valley, it's not an area that was always, predominantly desert like people think about today. You picture the Nile and you think desert. A river that's just surrounded by nothing but dust and sand. That's not always the case. The river valley, actually all of northern Africa, used to be plentiful and very fertile. Lots of crops, lots of trees. About 10,000 BCE, people began to migrate from the Red Sea hills into the Nile River Valley, and by 5000 BCE, people had migrated north out of Sudan and had settled in the Nile River Valley as well, kind of like the Aryans, how they migrated into northern India, and they found it was just a lot easier to settle down and farm. That's kind of what happened here. And they began to construct dikes and waterways and figured out ways to control the Nile River Valley. So about 4000 BCE, we have early kind of rural villages dotting the Nile River Valley, but it's still largely fragmented. Each city, each town kind of ran themselves. But of course, anytime you have irrigation and cultivation of crops, you're going to need to organize yourselves because life gets more complex when you're settling down and forming permanent settlements. So they will build irrigation projects and small cities, and these governments will be formed along these small cities. And of course, humans are greedy and they want more power, and so governments fight other governments, and cities fight other cities, and slowly you have the emergence of larger states. The unification of Egypt really begins with a king known as Menes. Menes is the first pharaoh, and pharaoh, of course, is a term used by Egyptians to identify their kings. We'll talk about that more in a second. Menes, we don't really think that he was actually a person. I shouldn't say he wasn't a person. His name wasn't necessarily Menes. We think his name was actually Narmer. But the writings we have are such that they're not written in the contemporary time period, so they're written hundreds of years later, and he was referred to as Menes at that time. But anyways, Menes, who's pictured on the right there, builds his capital city at Memphis, which is right here. And from Memphis, he's able to control the rich, fertile lands of the delta, where the Nile deposits into the Mediterranean Sea, and also control trade to the Levant over in this region. So naturally, it's a place of immense power. And we think at this time that the Egyptians began to rule as pharaohs. Pharaohs were not just kings, but they're individuals who believed that they were descendants from the gods, and therefore they had more power than any man on earth, and their power was unquestionable, absolute power, if you will. And so, ruling as a pharaoh with the directive of the gods and controlling this rich, wealthy area, naturally, they're going to be pretty powerful. Egypt is broken down into three different kingdoms, three different time periods. The first is the Old Kingdom, and you can see the dates there. And then we have the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And you'll notice there are two intermediate sessions. That's because these are time periods in Egyptian history where power isn't really easily defined. It's broken up. The kingdom doesn't survive. It's fragmented during these time periods. But during the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, the power of the kingdoms was pretty much absolute and unified. We'll talk about each one here in a second. Starting with the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was from 2686 to 2181 BCE. And it really was the time period when all the pyramids at Giza were built, like the Great Pyramid at Khufu, for example, the giant Great Pyramid that you think of when you probably picture pyramids in your head. So when we talk about the pyramids, we think of them as old too, but what a lot of people don't realize, if we go back here and look, the New Kingdom is in 1069, so these pyramids are 1,500 years old, even by the time you get to the New Kingdom. So they were old to the people who lived in the New Kingdom era as well. But during this time period, we also start seeing the conscription of labor. Conscription just means drafting. Like, think of a military draft. They literally drafted citizens into labor to work on large building projects such as pyramids, we think, and also probably dikes and irrigation canals and dams, and projects that generally were needed by the empire. There's also taxation set up during this time period, which, when you have taxes and you have large building projects and conscription of labor, generally people don't stay happy for very long, and so much money is being put into building these pyramids, these tombs for the pharaohs, that they run out of funds for other simple things, and they run out of funds to take care of society. So people get upset, and naturally it leads to rebellions. The pyramids. As I kind of said before, the pyramids, they're tombs for the pharaohs, and they're more than just tombs for their afterlife. You're building a symbol that is going to represent your power and your prestige, and so they put a great deal of effort into the pyramids. They also represent tremendous ability by the pharaohs to muster people to work for them, which is another demonstration of how much power the pharaohs actually had. They could pull all these workers together. The largest pyramid, Khufu, pictured there in the background, there's 2.3 million limestone blocks. Each block weighed 2.5 tons. So you need to have lots of labor to do this. The pyramid, the building project itself and how they built it, it's still for debate. No one really knows. There's a lot of theories out there, like ramps and levers used to try to lift the blocks into position, but obviously it took lots and lots of people to do this. The Middle Kingdom, I'll back up for a second. The Old Kingdom will collapse, like I said, because of all the money being spent on the pyramids, and we think there's also droughts that occurred as well, made people unhappy. So you had a period of time between the Old and Middle Kingdom where there was division, many different states ruling, basically different provinces. They call them nomes. Different nomes kind of ruled the land, and each leader of each nome, they're called nomarchs, not monarchs, nomarchs, and they ruled with absolute authority over their region. But it's reunited under the Middle Kingdom. The pharaohs begin to reclaim the lands they'd lost, and they begin to spread their power up and down the Nile, conquering the southern kingdom of the Kush, which would be in modern-day Sudan, all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. And during the Middle Kingdom, we see lots of advancement in arts and literature and science, mathematics. It's a time period that's characterized kind of as a renaissance almost of Egyptian history. We also see during this time period the democratization of afterlife. And all that really means is they begin to view afterlife not as something that's just for the upper class or for the pharaoh and their family or the royalty, which is how it was seen during the Old Kingdom. Now they begin to see that, or begin to believe, I should say, that everyone has access to the afterlife. One of the most famous Egyptian pieces of literature is the Book of the Dead, which is a misnomer because it's not really a book at all. Rather, it's just collections of the various spells and chants that people had to perform in order to access the afterlife. They believe there are 42 different negative confessions that one had to make to even enter the afterlife. And they could be as simple, and they were as simple as saying that you never lied, that you had never raised your voice in anger. And they get more complex, obviously, like I never killed anyone. But they had a very basic idea of something you had to say. You had to make these confessions in the presence of the god of the underworld, Osiris, in order to even be able to access the afterlife. And Osiris would weigh your heart to make sure it was the right weight in order to be able to access the afterlife as well. So there's a whole process that goes on with the afterlife. We'll talk more about the afterlife in a little bit. But it's really during the Middle Kingdom we begin to see the emergence of these ideas. As the Middle Kingdom will collapse, they will be replaced briefly by a group of people known as the Hyksos. And what happens? The Hyksos begin to migrate into the Nile Delta, really as individuals who are going to perform labor. They're coming to work. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs use them to help them build projects, to build their irrigation systems. In some cases, even as mercenaries. And many came as farmers, but really Hyksos just means, the Egyptian word Hyksos means foreign lands. So these are foreigners. In around 1674 BCE, they will take control of the eastern Nile River Delta and begin to expand outward. And the weakening of the Middle Kingdom, as a result of all the money spent on other things, as usual, makes them really ripe for conquest. And the Hyksos have two important technologies with them as well that helps them out here. They have the composite bow, which you can see pictured below. Basically, because of the shape of the bow, it made it so it could, with less pressure, less power, fire an arrow, greater distance and with more power. And then the wheeled chariot you see on the right-hand side. As I said before, whoever has technology is going to win. And they had the advanced technology, and they were able to use it to conquer for a brief period of time the Egyptian lands. And then we will have the reunification again of Egypt under the new kingdom, as pharaohs again will begin to take control and conquer little by little the different cities back from the Hyksos. They reclaim the lands. The New Kingdom, we don't see lots of emphasis on pyramids. They seem to have learned their lesson, that you can't spend all of your money building pyramids, and they begin to focus more on building their empire and expanding outward. And you can see they begin to push themselves across the Levant through modern-day Israel, formerly known as Palestine. So we see an expansion. And we also see a renewed interest in trying to establish trade relationships and trying to establish diplomacy with foreigners. It's also during this time that we see the pharaoh Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is a female, which is, it tells us a lot about the Egyptians and their idea about men and women. The fact that a woman was able to claim the highest title in the land, obviously, they had great respect for women. Now, it's definitely not a matriarchal society. It's still very patriarchal for the most part. But you do see more respect shown to women in this time period than most other early River Valley civilizations. Unfortunately, the Kushites from the south, the Kush from the south, and Assyrians coming in from the north and the east will eventually push and destroy Egypt by about the mid-6th century BCE. We talked about Egypt in the beginning. Really, in the beginning, Egypt was kind of a rural community. There was lots of small towns and villages, and they slowly emerged into building urban centers. And there's a number of urban centers, major urban centers, like Memphis, built by Menes, which was his center of power, Heliopolis. But also there's other Nubian cities in the south, too, such as Kerma, Napata, Meroe. These are all located at the cataracts on the Nile. Cataracts just mean like rushing rapids. The Nile had several spots where it was difficult to pass because of the river becoming very rough, and in some cases very shallow. And so along these spots we see large cities emerge where people would continue to trade. We also see well-defined social classes in Egypt. They don't have, it's not like the caste system, they didn't have places they're necessarily born and stuck into. You could certainly move up and down the social ladder. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. But all the way from pharaohs down to the slaves, we had social classes. And just like in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the most prized jobs in society was that of a scribe, as you will read in your blog assignment, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to. You also had economic specialization going on. Bronze metallurgy came in with the Hyksos. They developed iron by 900 BCE. Because these people are trading up and down the Nile River Valley and trading across into Mesopotamia, they do come in contact with lots of technologies which they will adapt over time. And they will trade both on the Nile River and they'll trade at sea in the Mediterranean. There's not as much Mediterranean trade as there is in the Nile. The Nile is safer, and generally people stick to what's safe and what they know. So the Nile really was the principal trade route, but there was, as I said, trade along the Mediterranean basin. Under Queen Hatshepsut, for example, we know that they're building 70-foot long boats that she was sending out to distant lands to acquire different products that she would, she was the first Egyptian to try to transplant plants, actually bring trees from other places and plant them in Egypt. One of the first people in history, we think, who did that. So they certainly are trading extensively during this time period. And of course, one of the most famous symbols of ancient Egypt is the hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs means holy inscriptions. The writing appeared around 3200 BCE, and hieroglyphs, you can see from the picture, they're pictographs. They're not, they weren't really necessarily an alphabet with letters. There were hieroglyphs that represent different letters, but a lot of the hieroglyphic writing was actually done just with pictures that represented words and ideas. We find this all over Egypt. I mean, it's everywhere. On the monuments, the buildings, inside the tombs, written on the sarcophagus. It's everywhere. On sheets of papyrus, which is the paper that they wrote on. Hieroglyphs, though, what people really don't realize, it wasn't the common language used in ancient Egypt. It was used really for holy situations, for religious writing, formal writing. They used other different types of writing, like Coptic and Meroitic and different things like that for other writing. But hieroglyphs are primarily for religious reasons and for formal government reasons. As far as religion goes, there's principal gods of Amun and Re, or Amun and Re. And these two gods are united as one god, and as we progress into the middle and then the late kingdom, or the new kingdom, sorry, Amun and Re serve as the principal god, kind of the overseer of all the gods. Think of like a Zeus. That's kind of their role. Under Akhenaten, though, things change. And we have a brief period of time where there's actually monotheism. Akhenaten tried to get people to worship the sun god Aten. He actually built a city dedicated entirely to Aten and moved his capital there. It doesn't really stick, though. People who have for centuries been worshiping one way don't want to just all of a sudden be forced into worshiping something else. So the monotheism is short-lived, and it dies with Akhenaten. And actually, the picture at the right there is King Tut, King Tutankhamun, who's very common and very well known around the world. King Tut was actually the son of Akhenaten. His name was actually Tutankhamun, but he was so disgusted with his father, he changed it to Tutankhamun, and he had all of the symbols of Aten destroyed and restored power to Amun-Re. The afterlife, as I mentioned earlier, is really important to Egyptians. Mummification is not just done as some weird idea. Mummification had purpose to it. They believe they're preserving the individual's body for the afterlife. And it wasn't always just the wealthy. Even the lower classes sometimes would be able to have enough money to mummify themselves and bury themselves in tombs. But it was typically upper class who could afford this. And in the beginning, they thought that it was just they thought that you would mummify the body so the body would preserve for the afterlife, and they would oftentimes fill tombs with various goods they would need for the afterlife. We began to realize that the pictures inside the walls, the drawings inside the walls of individuals and workers and the laborers and soldiers were actually more than just drawings. They were supposed to be there to go with the individual to the afterlife. We have stories of people mummifying their cats and mummifying their dogs. So mummification was a huge part of the Egyptian afterlife. And really, their view of the afterlife was positive. They thought that they were going to live in a place much like Egypt, where there wouldn't be problems and be glorious and wonderful. which gives the Egyptians a particularly optimistic view of the afterlife, in contrary to what Mesopotamians had, and they're a little more negative. The cult of Osiris is one of the religious cults that will become popular in Egypt. Cults are a popular idea throughout a lot of early civilizations where people focus on one particular god or goddess. The cult of Osiris was particularly big because he controlled the gate to the underworld. He was the person who could let you in. As I said earlier with the Book of the Dead, he was the person who you had to do your negative confessions to him, as well as there were other gods as well who were there, but he was ultimately the decider. He's the one who would weigh your heart and determine if you could pass on to the afterlife. And then the last part of this chapter deals with Bantu migrations. Bantu meaning people. Bantu is a language, and we know that the Bantu people spread throughout all of sub-Saharan Africa because we find their linguistic patterns throughout the region. There's over 500 variations of the Bantu language and over 90 million people who speak that language today, or some variation of that language today. The Bantu people are particularly important because as they spread throughout all these regions seen here on the map, they bring with them agriculture, they bring with them metallurgy, and so they're really responsible for the spread of agriculture and metallurgy to much of sub-Saharan Africa. And that concludes this little PowerPoint on Chapter 3.